Hi there, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Shuckburgh, and we are exploring the beautiful region of the Cotswolds in southwest England, following in the trail of Herbert Evans, who cycled around this region and wrote about his experiences in this wonderful book, The Highways and Byways in Oxford and the Cotswolds, published in 1905, 114 years ago. Hello there, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Shuckburgh, and welcome to the second episode of our documentaries about the Cotswolds. You find us today on Edgehill. This extraordinary steep slope is the site of the first major pitched battle in the Civil War. War had been declared for some time before this battle, but the two armies had yet to meet. They were marching towards one another, the Royalists from Warwick towards London, and Essex, in charge of the Parliamentarian army, moving to intercept him. It's really difficult to imagine this in our modern day and age when communications are so good, but they really didn't know where they were or where each of their opponent was. And it wasn't until the two quartermasters for these two armies, searching for billets and food in the villages behind me here, bumped into one another, and with much consternation realized that the two armies must be very, very close. They raced back to their respective bosses and warned them that a battle was imminent. The Royalists gathered on the top of this ridge where there were no trees in those days, so it was a bare hill, and the Parliamentarians in the valley below. Not surprisingly, the Parliamentarians had no wish to try and attack the Royalist army up this incredibly steep slope, and so it would have been a stalemate. It's possible Charles could have headed for London at that moment, but he decided not to because he was feared that he might arrive in London with a hostile reception and the army at his back. So he felt a confrontation was inevitable. He moved his soldiers off the hill down into the valley, and they lined up on the 23rd of October for the first pitched battle of the war. So here we are, we're standing on the ridge, on the side of the ridge here of Edgehill, with the hill behind us, looking out over this extraordinary valley. And right here is the church farm. You can see the church about 700 or 800 yards in that direction. And then beyond that, in the flat fields of this extraordinary valley we're looking out over, is where the armies drew up in front of one another for their battle. It must have been the most extraordinary sight and noise. Nearly 12,000 men on each side, a lot of artillery, pikes and swordsmanship. It must have been the most remarkable sight for those people standing on this ridge. The battle started at 3:30 in the afternoon on Sunday the 23rd of October, 1642. Neither army was particularly experienced, so it took them some hours to get themselves ready for conflict. The Parliamentarian army numbered around 12,500, and the Royalists a few hundred more, and the king, dressed in black velvet lined with ermine, rode through the ranks of his army, encouraging them to give of their best. His nephew, Prince Rupert, was in command of his cavalry and was to play a key part in the battle, which started with a huge bombardment, fairly ineffectually, but very frightening. Then Rupert's cavalry charged across the valley to engage his Parliamentarian opposite numbers, scattering them and causing them to flee. At this stage it would have been sensible for him to return to the battlefield to support the rest of the Royalist army, and if he had done so, it's quite possible that the day would have been won and the whole history of England would have been very different. Instead, Rupert followed the fleeing Parliamentarians, came across their baggage train, and decided to allow his men to loot and plunder. And by the time he returned, the battle had swung in the Parliamentarians' favour. Whilst his later contribution did make the battle end in a draw, it deprived the king of victory. In the morning, exhausted by their efforts the previous day, both armies retired from the battlefield. The king to Banbury, where he was to capture the castle and create a lasting stronghold, and the Earl of Essex to London, where he set up defences which made it impossible for the king ever to capture the capital. This place really is quite extraordinary. It's so atmospheric. You really can imagine what it must have been like with those great armies out on the fields out there, battling away. We're going slightly south from here now to Compton Winyates to see one of the most remarkable houses in the area, and then on during this episode to Hook Norton, possibly even Shipston on Stour. Come with me. When Evans, our invaluable 20th century guide, left Edgehill, he rode his bicycle south on what was then a rough track along the ridge of the Cotswold escarpment, and described what he saw as follows. For the first part of our journey, the riding is fairly easy. We may, if we please, dismount a couple of miles from Edgehill and follow a tangled lane to the edge of the declivity. Hence there is a vast prospect across the vale towards Shipston, Ilmington, Stratford and beyond. The footpaths are still there for the more adventurous amongst you. He was heading to Compton Winyates, the spectacular home of the Marquess of Northampton, but unfortunately in this age of high security it's no longer possible for any of us to visit this house, so we're headed for Brailes and its landmark church. On the way, we couldn't resist a small detour to the village of Epwell, spelt E-P-W-E-L-L, but pronounced Epwell. This tiny hamlet won't welcome you unless you are small in number and respectful of their home, but the miniature 14th century church is in marked contrast to the large Cotswold churches we're used to, and is surrounded by ancient cottages huddled together down its tiny narrow lanes. It is very beautiful. Brailes sits at the base of the escarpment and has a church visible from miles around that promises to be fascinating. Ross and I stopped off at the village pub called the George opposite the church, where we sampled a delicious pint and a sandwich, and then we crossed the road into the churchyard. Evans writes of this lovely church in Brailes. The church stands in the highest part of the village, not far from the inn, which he was recommending, which was the George, just across the road here. Nothing can be finer than the exterior, the lofty tower, 120 feet high and wide in proportion, the long clerestory rising above the aisles, the open foliated parapet on the south side with a cornice elaborately carved with grotesques beneath, and the rich orange tints of the stone command our wonder and admiration. Enter the church, and alas, the scene is changed. The expectations raised by such an outside are doomed to disappointment. The plaster has been ruthlessly scraped from the walls. Almost every trace of the sanctifying hand of time has been removed, and the whole has a strange, cold look, from the contrast with the exterior all the more repellent. He really was cross. Mind you, I think it's beautiful. Let's see what you think. Just a couple of miles from Brailes, on the edge of the little village of Stourton, is an old friend of the Cotswold explorer, the Cotswolds Distillery. Set up around 5 years ago by Daniel Zohr, who we interviewed at the Junipalooza Gin Festival in London a couple of years back. This is one of the district's great business success stories. Originally set up as a whiskey distillery, Daniel decided to make a gin to give himself some cash flow for the first few years, and now he makes one of the most successful local gins in the country, along with his extremely fine whiskies. Recently, he's upgraded his visitor centre, and now you can eat and drink here as well as filling your own bottle with whiskey straight from the cask. The guided tours of the distillery are regular, fascinating, and extremely tasty, but make sure you book in advance. It's become something of a major local attraction. Right next to Stourton is the little town of Shipston on Stour. Shipston on Stour is one of those many villages that built up as staging posts for travellers between more important places. The steepness of the terrain and the state of the ancient roads meant that horses had to be rested regularly, so these villages sprang up in convenient places. Its situation on the River Stour gave Shipston its importance as a river crossing, but also its main medieval industry of wool washing. We're now heading off to Stow-on-the-Wold, and on the way we'll drop off at one of the most ancient sites of interest in the whole region, the Rollright Stones. The origins of these stones is disputed. It's certainly Celtic, but quite possibly from an even earlier civilization, but its legends are numerous. Evans writes as follows: "A certain king, the name is not as a rule remembered, had set forth at the head of his forces to conquer all England. But as he went up the hill on which Rollright stands, there appeared to him the witch to whom the ground belonged. The king was now within a few steps of the crest of the hill, and from which the village of Long Compton would be visible in the coombe below, when she stopped him with the words, 7 long strides shalt thou take, and if Long Compton thou canst see, King of England thou shalt be." The king, who now thought his success assured, cried out exultingly, "Stick, stock, stone, as King of England I shall be known." So he took 7 strides forward. But lo and behold, instead of looking down on Long Compton, there rose before him the long mound of earth which still stands before the King's Stone. And the witch said, "As Long Compton thou canst not see, King of England thou shalt not be. Rise up, stick, and stand still, stone, for King of England thou shalt be none. Thou and thy men hoar stones shall be, and I myself an eldon tree." Thereupon the king and his army were turned into stones where they stood, the king on the side of the mound, and his army in a circle behind him, while the witch herself became an elder tree. You can believe that sort of stuff if you want to. It's pretty good fun. Now we're coming into Stow-on-the-Wold. So here we are in the wonderful market square of Stow-on-the-Wold. Stow stands about 800 feet above sea level. It's the highest town in the whole of the Cotswolds. It sits on a hill of its own, surveying all around it. And most importantly, it's at the junction of 3 separate main roads, big Roman highways. One of them is called Salt Way, and the other, perhaps most important, the Foss Way, of which we'll hear a bit more over the next few episodes. It's the junctions like this that people over the centuries have gathered to meet and to trade. Initially, the prominence of the site persuaded our Stone and Bronze Age ancestors to settle here, and there's still evidence of their presence to be found. And the Romans built the great highways that converge here, but it was the abbots at the manor of Morgsbury, a satellite of Evesham Abbey about a mile south of here, who really encouraged Stow to grow into the market town it was to become. This impressive and incredibly beautiful square has witnessed markets since 1107, when the first market charter was granted by Henry II. Later, in 1330, Edward III granted a 7-day fair in this wonderful town of Stow, which was subsequently changed and superseded by 2 5-day fairs around the saints' feast days in May and October, which now continue to this day. It became one of the greatest of the sheep markets in this extremely sheep-laden region. In fact, the writer Daniel Defoe recorded that at one time 20,000 sheep were sold in this square in one single day. Leading off this wonderful market square are several small, narrow, windy lanes. They were purposely built narrow and windy when the square was laid out in order to control the flow of sheep and to enable people to count them as they went. In the 19th century, the local bank closed its doors for the last time, and despite no doubt heroic efforts by the locals, they failed to identify the ownership of most of the money. So after a while they decided to spend it, and they built the building behind me. It's called St. Edward's Hall, and it now houses the local museum, which has a really interesting collection of portraiture based around the Civil War, both royalist and parliamentarian, and also the local library. It's a lovely building. It sits right in the middle of what was the original large square, so it encloses it all a bit more, but it's quite an interesting Gothic building. The very last open battle of the Civil War took place at Stow. In 1646, a royalist army under the command of Sir Jacob Astley was marching to join up with the king at Oxford when he was intercepted by the parliamentarians at Stow. His army was driven into the square, where many of them were slain, and over 1,000 were imprisoned in the church. So great was the slaughter that legend has it that ducks bathed in the blood running down the streets, giving rise to the naming of Digbeth Street, supposedly for Duckbath Street. A stone commemorating the battle is to be found in the churchyard of St. Edward's Church. Whilst there is evidence of a Saxon church on this site, the one you see today is largely 11th century, with 15th century additions. The 88-foot tower was completed in 1447 and houses what are reputed to be the loudest bells in all of Gloucestershire. This pub behind me seems to be widely accepted as the oldest pub in England. It used to be called the Royalist, but in 2013 it was bought by the Henley-based brewery Breilles, and they reverted it to its medieval name of the Porch House. It appears that the first inn was registered on this site in 987 AD. Now that really is old. It's said there's a tunnel between this pub and the church that is just behind Ross. It doesn't specify exactly why, and there are many houses in this village that have tunnels running from their cellars, usually going nowhere, probably dug in order to use the stone to build the houses themselves and subsequently used as storage. It's possible to romanticize ancient buildings a little too much, but this is a rather wonderful and very, very ancient pub. Well, after that, I think both Ross and I deserve a pint. So now we're headed for the home of one of the very last Victorian tower breweries in the country, Hook Norton. On the way, we'll drop off the main road for a brief visit to the villages of Swell. Pretty places, and a timely reminder to those of you travelling free that a little adventurousness is usually rewarded. The Cotswolds is an extraordinarily varied region. There are large, bustling 21st century towns where modern life drives everything, despite their ancient architectural history. There are small towns that have adapted their medieval buildings and infrastructure to deal with the demands of the time. And then there are villages which seem slowly to have evolved from ancient farming communities into what we in this century see as incredibly beautiful relics of a simpler time, when everything moved more slowly and people were nicer to one another. Now, of course, nothing is ever that simple, but Hook Norton does seem to fit very neatly into that latter category. The village is first mentioned in 917 in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. At that time, its name meant village on the slopes of Hocker. No one seems to know who Hocker was. Like most of the old villages in the area, Hook Norton started life as a small river crossing around which an agricultural community grew. Farmhouses surrounded by the hovels and cottages of the farm labourers, usually thatched roofed with wooden structures. As things improved, the houses were increasingly built of local stone, and the village started to take on the feel of the Hook Norton we know today. Sitting as it does on the eastern edge of the Cotswolds, it stands on an ironstone ridge, quite different from the gold or grey limestone for which the region is famous. This not only influenced the style and look of the buildings, but from the late 1800s into the 20th century, it gave Hook Norton a taste of the Industrial Revolution. The arrival of the railway in Hookie marked the beginning of a new industry using the very rock on which it stood. The ironstone was mined and smelted in the village and started a new period of wealth and success. The incredible effort required to build the railway brought thousands of workers to the village. Tunnels and cuttings were dug and viaducts constructed to take the line through the hills and valleys. Remnants of the work are still visible today. A brewery was built to quench the thirst of the workers. Once the railway closed in the 1960s, the mining obviously stopped, but the brewery continued. Hook Norton Brewery is still the biggest employer in the village by far, certainly one of the very few remaining Victorian tower breweries still in existence, let alone working, and the source of one of the finest brews in the nation. I think we better go and see them. Come with me, and we'll meet Mark Graham, who's going to show us around. Wow, this is your engine?
Yes, this is the original steam engine, so it would have powered everything within the brewery,
right,
including these two water pumps, which are no longer used, but their job would have been obviously pump the water up from below the brewery,
right,
where the water source comes from.
You have your own wells sunk beneath.
We do, yeah. There's another borehole in the back field now, but it's like an aquifer.
Yep.
So we share it with Breilles and Palace.
Oh, do you really?
We brewed a beer for them, and they wanted to use their spring water, so we tanked it over, and then we tested it and worked out that actually it's the same water.
It's exactly the same.
Then James just thought we might want to bottle it, but that idea didn't happen. So
okay.
But yeah, it's again another reason why the brewer's here, because there's a natural water source.
Yes.
You've got the crops, you've got the it's kind of all the ingredients are here to brew beer. But yeah, original steam engine from 1899.
Right.
We still run it on the first Saturday of each month because you get a lot of enthusiasts about the steam engines want to come along and see it working.
Yes, well, it's obviously very beautifully kept. I mean, there are these things are really rare now, aren't they?
They are. We think it's the only one in the UK that can still be used for its original use. So these wires, this is a gauge, obviously goes right up to the top floor where the water tanks are.
Right.
So we can tell that we've got 4 foot or 3 foot of water in the tanks at the moment, which means we can make 135 barrels of beer.
Oh, so really? So it does the conversion for you as well?
Yeah, so those go right at the top, and there's a little, right at the top there's obviously a gauge.
Yeah. Okay, so and this takes us through the whole process.
Yeah, so cold liquor or water goes in the top. Then you've got your grist mill, which so then you get your multi-barley up into there.
Right.
So you mill it into the hopper. Then you take your water, you warm it up, you mix the two together in the mash tuns, which we'll just see in a minute.
Right.
Basically a brewer's porridge. And then that gets drained off into the copper, which is through there, where it gets heated. At that point, you can then add your hops.
Right.
Down into the hop back. Where it sits for a while, and then it gets transferred back up into the fermenting tuns. So leaving the hops behind, that's why it's called a hop back.
Yeah, so
you don't take
keeping
the hops
behind.
Ended up in the fermenting tuns, which will in the fermenting room.
Yeah.
Where it sits for about a week, and then it gets dropped down into the storage tank, and then into the casks and out the door.
So the fermenting tuns, you've cooled it a bit before it gets to the.
Sorry, yeah, that's the heat exchanger here. Yeah, so
and then it comes. So your fermentation is taking place at a fairly low temperature, then, not too hot.
No.
Okay.
So it's a strong volume beer today.
Yep.
So large mash, but fairly little runoff.
Right.
So out of about 3 ton of malt, we're only going to get about 78 barrels.
Oh, I see. Right, okay.
So that's why it's so full in there.
Yeah.
But we're only going to get about 78 barrels from that.
Yes, I see.
So we just started the sparge.
And this sprinkling process is a business of turning it over? Is it?
Basically what's happening is when they mashed in this morning, obviously used the steel smasher. Up in the top of there is the dry grist, so it's the crushed barley. It was mixed in with water at 155 Fahrenheit, because we work in Fahrenheit still.
Yes, right. Okay,
and
at least I understand it. Yes,
and then it sits in there for an hour and a quarter.
Right. And that's just soaking.
It's basically just soaking. It starts all the enzymes and all the sugars starting to break that, like come out of the malt.
Yeah, right.
Basically, if you imagine like a big tea bag sat there,
absolutely,
sort of stewing into the water
kind of
that's in there.
infusion of a kind. Yes. Mark's fascinating tour took us to the very top of this building to see the mill itself, the old winches and lifts that take the grain and yeast off the lorries and up to the higher floors of the building. The whole process laid out and set up so many years ago, and still brewing brilliant beer to this day. It's an incredible insight into a Victorian way of life that remains totally relevant and efficient in the 21st century. Slightly less efficient, but certainly worth preserving, are the huge horses that pull the drays that deliver to the local hooky estate. These days, tourism forms an important part of the brewery's business. They have a fascinating museum here. You can book a tour of the brewery to experience the whole thing yourself. We do strongly recommend a visit. If you want to find out any more about the village before you visit, the Hook Norton Local History Group has an excellent website, and the village museum and archive is based in the brewery itself. Well, we've had an amazing time at the Hook Norton Brewery. Thank you to Mark for showing us around. It is a fascinating process, and it's rather wonderful to see this business develop into a tourist attraction the way it is. Don't forget, you can find us on Facebook and on Twitter. Look for our website, thecotswoldexplorer.co.uk, where you'll find everything we do. Next time, we're heading northwest to Winchcombe, no doubt visiting various little villages on the way. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you there.